Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Let me ask you about the EITC Stakeholder Summit that's going on. What we need is one more summit, but we do need a solution to this. What do you expect to get out of this summit and the people that are gathered there?
Well, we would hope that somebody's going to come up with additional ideas. When I started over 2 years ago, we held an internal meeting of everybody in the IRS who had ever dealt with this problem to try to figure out, okay, what's it take to solve this problem? We've been working on it for 10 years and made relatively little progress.
Right, and you and I have had multiple conversations about it.
Right, and out of that came the request for W-2s earlier, which I think we will find will help significantly. Out of that came a request for requiring minimum qualifications for tax preparers. It's not that, there are crooks and you're never going to get them out of business, but this is a complicated statute, and a lot of preparers have no background in it at all. As somebody said, your barber has more qualifications and has to go through more standards than to cut your hair than to prepare your taxes, which he doesn't have to do at all. So that will help significantly. If we could get what we're now calling correction procedures for specific errors. Part of our problem is we audited about 350,000 EITC returns last year. About a third of our audits are in that area trying to, in fact, fight improper payments wherever we can. Our problem is if we have a database from Social Security or someone else, a reliable database, and we can see an error in the return, the only way we can make that correction is to actually go out and do an audit, send you a letter, have somebody contact you in the field. If we had, and we're calling, it used to be called something else, but we're trying to say it would be for specific errors, we'd have a correction procedure that, much like math error, would say, if you say, you earned X and Social Security tells us you earned Y, we make the adjustment, let you know the adjustment. You still have all your rights to object and say, no, I really did earn that money or did not earn that money, as the case might be. But at that point, we've made the adjustment. We've stopped the payment. Right now, all we can do is send you a letter and audit you. Otherwise, the payments have to go through. So it frustrates our people no end to say, we haven't got enough resources to audit people. And in fact, we're never going to audit our way out of the problem. But if we can increase the capacity of return preparers who prepare almost 60% of these returns to understand what the statute is, if we can get the W-2s earlier, which we will, to match them, and if we have the ability when we see an error to correct it, then I think we will begin to make a dent.
But that's a legislative correction that you need to
and
do.
And those are the correction procedure would be a legislative change, and as would be the minimum qualifications for tax preparers.
We've talked before about dual tracking on returns. When you talk about the ability of, if you're a certified preparer and you've got this certification, your tax return comes out faster. All of these tax preparers all advertise the same thing, speed. So you're in the normal lane if you're certified. If you're not a certified, you're in the slow lane, basically. That is an incentive for folks to be able to go and to be able to get this. Obviously, individuals would be in the normal fast lane. You would.
As we discussed, I thought that was a creative idea. One of the things we've done along those lines, we have a voluntary return preparer program where you get a certificate of completion. What we said for this year is if you don't have a certificate of completion, you can't represent the taxpayer in tax matters. You have to be either a CPA or an enrolled agent who are already qualified, or a tax attorney, or you have to have a certificate of completion to be able to represent the taxpayer. And again, our hope was that will encourage taxpayers to say, well, gee, if you don't have a certificate, you can't represent me. I'm going to have to find another preparer. So it's the same theory of, can we incentivize people to actually get the minimum standards of education? We're not talking about regulations where we go out and look at them. We just want them to have...
Just to know the rules.
Exactly. If they just... It's a complicated statute, so it's not as if it's easy. But yeah, they ought to know the rules, and they ought to be able to demonstrate that before they can hang out a shingle.
Is there anyone in your agency, whether it's you or someone else, that can make proposals to Congress to simplify this very complicated statute?
Yes, again...
I know y'all deal with this all the time.
Policy issues really are the domain of the administration and the Congress. But when I say that, I'm usually going to tell you a policy issue. If you could streamline the statute, it would make it easier for preparers, for beneficiaries, and certainly for the IRS for tax administration.
Okay. As you're sharing databases among the federal government, you talked about Social Security before. Which database is the most reliable that you actually share information with back and forth that's helpful to you in that preparation? Or which database do you need to have access to you don't?
I'm sorry, which?
databases. Which database do you have access to that you don't have access to? You mentioned Social Security.
Yeah, Social Security, we've actually, there's a new hire database that gives you information for people's moving into the workforce and out, which we do not have total access to, which would be very helpful.
Why?
Social Security
Is it statutory that you don't have it, or why?
It's basically would be helpful to, there's a question of whether the agency has the authority to provide it to us. If we had statutory authority that made it clear, that would make life easier.
Okay, ID theft has been a huge issue. You and I have talked about it as well before. Some of the things were addressed in the omnibus last year to deal with some basic ID theft and some of the verification parts of it. What is pending at this point, and what do you need to further finish out the ID theft part of this?
ID theft is primarily a question of just making sure we have our resources at the right level, and that's why I feel so strongly about streamlined critical pay. It's only
you've got this 16-digit pilot program coming out with the W-2 this year. Is that correct?
Yes, we have.
It's already started. Do you have any preliminary data of how it's being used?
Yes, thus far, this pilot program, which basically provides an algorithm to the W-2 so we can verify it, and we have four tax preparers participating with us. And thus far, it does exactly what we expected. We can actually take people when we've got a verified W-2 and move them out of the queue for holding refunds up while we're looking at them. And it allows us to have greater confidence that the suspicious returns are, in fact, worth looking at, because, in fact, if you can't create the algorithm, it means there's some real risk that the W-2 is false. So that's a significant step forward. The biggest thing we've made since I testified here last, the biggest change is just about a year ago, I brought the CEOs of the major tax preparers, software developers, payroll providers, and the state tax commissioners to a meeting in Washington, and I told them the purpose wasn't for me to tell them what to do. The purpose was for us to form a partnership to work together across the entire tax system to try to fight identity theft, and we've had a tremendous positive response from the private sector as well as the states. And it's resulted in this filing season already in a significant volume of sharing of information of suspicious activities, what are called leads from the private sector and us, and we share information back to them in a way that we've never been able to do before. The response was such that by last summer, the private sector participants moved from requesting to demanding that we make it permanent, which we're going to do because it's an effective partnership. It allows the states to work together and have standards. At the first meeting, the private sector people said, well, we need to have a standard for what authentication we're going to require of our clients, and you have to provide that. And I said, well, you're the only one who would have the authority. I said, I'm happy to do that as long as it's a standard that you all design with us and that you can live with, and it's happened. We also have 83% of tax preparers already providing us leads of suspicious activities that are going on. So it's, of all the things we've done, it's probably going to be the most significant going forward step we've taken, because the partnership with the private sector and the states means that, and we're now including financial institutions where refunds are deposited. Right. So we hopefully will authenticate taxpayers at the front end more significantly when they go to their preparer. Our filters are getting more and more sophisticated, so we'll stop suspicious returns. And to the extent financial institutions can identify returns that deposit that look suspicious.
And multiple deposits into the same account.
Yes, and multiple deposits in the same account, deposits into an account it's not the taxpayer's account. We think all of that's going to help.
Okay, thank you.